Sri Lanka is in the middle of an economic crisis that sparked massive protests and triggered a political, social, and humanitarian crisis. The Prime Minister, Cabinet, and finally the President have been forced to resign, but not without a colossal uprising by the people. Gotabaya Rajapaksa, a former military man and the brother of war-winning former President Mahinda Rajapaksa, came to power 3 years ago. He promised to strengthen national security after the 2019 Easter Sunday terror attacks. However, the COVID-19 pandemic, massive tax relief promised before the presidential election, and an overnight ban on chemical fertilizers contributed to a depletion of foreign reserves. This made it impossible to purchase fuel, domestic gas, and other essentials. People began protesting, first in small groups, but later, with long power cuts and even longer queues for essential goods, the demonstrations increased and gained traction. On the 31st of March, people gathered in Mirihana outside President Rajapaksa's private residence. But what began as a small protest turned into a massive occupation of the small suburb and ended with police beating protesters and unleashing tear gas and water cannons on them. A police bus was burned in retaliation. The following day is considered the beginning of the Janatha Aragalaya, or the people's struggle, when lawyers in the hundreds turned out to represent and protect the rights of the protesters who were arrested in the aftermath of the Mirihana protest. With that momentum, the enraged public soon began organizing a peaceful protest. Their hope was to bring 1 million people to Galle on the 9th of April. However, what many thought would end in a day went on for months, and over 1 million people attended the Galle occupation. Tents sprang up as a makeshift hamlet. Gota Gama was established at the demarcated protest site at the famous beachfront. In a show of solidarity, people began to share food and drinks for free. A first aid center, legal center, library, and other community services were quickly established as the peaceful protest grew in numbers, creativity, and strength. But everything changed on the 9th of May. Hundreds of pro-government supporters who had attended a meeting at Temple Trees, the office of the Prime Minister, stormed peaceful protest sites in Colombo as police watched on. At the meeting, Prime Minister Mahinda Rajapaksa and his son, Sports and Youth Minister at the time Namal Rajapaksa, met with the pro-government supporters who asked the Prime Minister not to resign. Government MPs Johnston Fernando, Pavitra Wanniyarachi, Sanath Nishantha and Rohitha Abegunawardena were also seen at the meeting inciting violence. The attack provoked an evening of counterattacks by vigilantes across the island, who retaliated by humiliating pro-government supporters, assaulting them and burning houses of MPs and their supporters. A government MP in Nitambua was brutally gunned down. The violence unleashed and the intensity of public outrage was so immense that Prime Minister Mahinda Rajapaksa resigned that night, followed by his entire cabinet of ministers. Ranil Wickremesinghe, a seasoned politician and opposition MP, was appointed in his place. Many assumed that Wickremesinghe's appointment would end the protests and accelerate negotiations with the International Monetary Fund, whose help Sri Lanka is currently counting on for recovery from bankruptcy. But not only was Wickremesinghe seen as a regime enabler by many, but he was also not able to turn the fortunes of the country as he believed he could. The protest continued, and aid hoped for from foreign countries and the IMF didn't come as expected. 2 months after Wickremesinghe was appointed, another show of peaceful dissent was organized for the 9th of July. Thousands deprived of fuel, domestic gas, and essential items marched, hitchhiked, or cycled to Colombo to register their disapproval of the government led by Rajapaksa and Wickremesinghe. The police and military responded using tear gassing and water cannons, but the crowds were so large and strong that police and armed forces were quickly overpowered. That day, the protesters broke into and occupied the president's official residence in Fort, the prime minister's residence known as the Temple Trees, and the presidential secretariat. For days afterwards, nameless, faceless crowds of people thronged Colombo to visit the former seats of power.
There's some joy for Sri Lankans as hundreds and thousands of citizens took to the streets to celebrate Gotabaya Rajapaksa's resignation.
President Gotabaya Rajapaksa, finally responding to months-long calls for Gota go home, left the country and resigned a few days later. But things are far from settled on the tiny island. Prime Minister Ranil Wickremesinghe was voted in as president by a parliament made up of Rajapaksa supporters, leading many to believe that although they ousted the president, his hand of power still remained over the country. Wickramasinghe's private residence was burned by protesters on the 13th of July, and ever since gaining power, his government has cracked down on protesters, protest leaders, dissenters, those that occupied state property, as well as those responsible for attacking the homes of MPs and for burning his home. The MPs responsible for instigating violence on peaceful protesters on the 9th of May remain in Parliament and have not been arrested. The people may have ousted a president, but they are yet to gain power.